Okay, before we start our class today, let's recite doa first. Okay, together. Pray, begin. A'udzu billahi minasyaitonir rajim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Rabbi shrah li sadri
صدري
wa yassir
ويسر
li
لي
amri
أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي ربي زدني علما وارزقني فهما واجعلني من الصالحين إن صلاتي ونسكي ومحياي ومماتي لله رب العالمين.
Al-Fatihah. Amin ya rabbal alamin.
Okay, thank you, Amir. So next, we're going to move on to next session. Yeah, before the start our main session, let's welcome our teacher in English for Industry, Miss Dian. She will have Miss Dian, and she will have one or two things that she want to say. So, time is yours, Miss Dian.
Okay. Thank you so much, Najwa. So this is gonna be the for the what is that? The class of popular literature, and uh, first of all, express my gratitude to my previous supervisor, Mr. Dian Nurrachman, and then I still remember you were the one of the consultant when I was in university taking my bachelor degree. Yeah, and we talk a lot about the English literature, and then I still remember like uh, at that time there was the division like between literature and linguistic, and then you suggest me to join the literature class. And when I yeah, when I was initially wanted to join linguistic, and then yeah, I think you suggest it's really worth it. And then from that moment, it's just like for the new beginning for me. Like I studied the literature from the many different kind of medias, and then I was introduced to Foucault, and then also to Derrida, deconstruction, and things like that. So that was totally the new horizon for me, and I was really, really thankful for that. And then for today, for this course in popular literature, I want you to share a bit about the myth and the fantasy. Of course, somehow this is going to be the first meeting, and then I hope it's gonna worth it. And then also you give us the new insight because especially this uh, program study is specialized for English for industry. So, yeah, so somehow anything about the literature, it is related to the industry itself, including popular literature and then also fantasy, myth, and the ideology itself. So we are ready to have the lecture from you. And then thank you so much for your availability to attend the class today. And that's all from me. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Miss Dian. Okay. So this is the main session. Yeah. we're going to continue Mr. Dian, such as the speaker from this session. Thank you, Mr. Dian. So, time is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. And then first thing first, I think I also would like to say my gratitude to Miss Dian, who has invited me in this guest lecture for EFI English for Industry study program. And I think this is a kind of an honor for me to speak here, also to give some lectures about the things that related to the industry itself. And I think this is also an important thing to recognize when we share some values about the myth, about the fantasy, and then so on and so forth. Because industrial things in nowadays moment has tremendously considered as something what else something important in life, and there are so many things that we can also discuss from this kind of industrial things, such as also the fantasy literature. Okay, just moderator, I think allow me to share screen. Yeah, it is still some request. Request has been sent to you. Okay. Is it available? Is this in your screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. If okay, wait a minute. And what is my camera? Wait a minute. I lost my cam. Stop share first. I lost my cam. Okay. And then I'm going to share with you again. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I think let's get started to discuss uh, the discussion for today in terms of the title, which is delivered to me from Miss Dian, is from myth to modern fantasy, identity, ideology, and the cultural impact. This is, I think, I gave you also a kind of another subtitle, a journey beyond reality. Means that when we are talking about myth or fantasy, something beyond ourselves, something beyond our world. This is actually a kind of a journey, but a journey beyond reality, beyond the reality that we experience for daily life. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's start for this one. Okay, what is it? Why it doesn't move? Right. Okay. So I'm going to start the discussion on from myth to modern fantasy by discussing the origins in myth and folklore. Well, when we are talking about fantasy literature, actually, this fantasy literature has deep roots in ancient myths, not only myths but also legends and folklores. Yeah, long before the modern genre emerged, like the fantasy we recognize today. Actually, we recognize the fantasy elements in myths, in any kind of myths, cultural myths, like the origins of the land, like the legends of the heroes, and the folklores about something which actually became one of the most foundational elements of the modern genre of fantasy itself for nowadays recognitions. And well, long before the modern genre, myths, cultures around the world told stories of gods, heroes, and monsters to explain the unknown and its shared values. And it means that something connected to the shared values we have in nowadays context. Actually, it came from any kind of things connected to the explanation of the unknown. When we don't have any understandings about the ghost and about the let's say about something connected to magical things, miracles, something like that. And so, therefore, we can find the explanations from religion, for instance, from also myth, and any kind of things that connected to the what is that? Um, the stories which told also about gods, about heroes and monsters, and so on and so forth. So these foundational myths serve as cultural narratives that communities use to define identity and worldview. Of course, that we actually um, may construct a worldview, our own worldview, our own ideology. Later on, we will talk it about ideology because we also share the same values, and then therefore this kind of foundational myths, this kind of let's say the explanation of the unknown can be constructed as the narratives to define our own identity and our own worldview. For example, in other cultures, we actually recognize the Epic of Gilgamesh, for instance, for the Mesopotamian culture, as something huge and something tremendous to be recognized and to be studied. Um, and also in Greek culture, we also recognize Homer's Odyssey. We can recognize Homer's Iliads and Odyssey, which actually um, written around 800 to 900 BC, and therefore they're also something which actually can construct the identity of the Greek people until nowadays, until today, and also the Fantastic Quest and monsters, for instance, just as medieval Arthurian legends. Well, okay, wait a minute. My camera is so off again. Is it about connection, perhaps? Is it okay if I'm not uh, opening my cam?
Sure, Mister. That's okay.
Okay, yeah. I'm like this. I'm so sorry for that because I don't know. Just about the connection, perhaps. Wait a minute. Yeah. Okay. On again. Oh, off again. What was? Okay. I think I'm going to continue first. While also waiting for the connection. Good connection. Well, just as medieval Arthurian legend. Arthurian legends in English, actually in British people, actually one of the constructions to have good memorable things in British values in British culture, and then also in another region we also recognize 1001 Nights in Arabic literature, in Arabic culture. Those actually provide templates for magic and heroism. And such ancient tales often carried moral lessons for explaining natural phenomena functioning that modern fantasy also continues. Yeah, it means that the modern fantasy also what is that? Recorded those kind of foundational myths, those kind of um, what is that? The fantasies, the legends, and the folklore too. They continued in their works in their um, fantasy in modern context. And indeed, by drawing on cultural memory and myth, fantasy creates a space for humanity's desire to experience the real and find the truth. In this way, well, fantasy stories reuse archetypes, wise mentors, tricksters figures, heroic journeys that recur in global myth. Well, I think these recurring patterns show that fantasy emerged from the folklore and myths of Europe, Asia, and Africa and beyond, serving as a collective cultural identity across time. Well, something we have for nowadays context actually in global culture, we actually also share the same or the similar values from the fantasy um, from another region, from another what is that continent, from another culture, something like that one. Then, therefore, I took the theory of fantasy from Neil Wyatt and George G. Sharitz to what is that? To analyze or not to analyze, but to explain why then fantasy literature is really important as well in nowadays context. Wait a minute for the next slides. This why it doesn't move. Wait a minute. There's something wrong, I think. Okay. Wait a minute. This is actually the third slides. Okay, according to Joe C. Sarik's in their book, wait a minute. Yeah, in the third edition of 2019 publication. They located fantasy's deepest roots in myth. So it is, um, what is that? Um, Along with my arguments previously. So Sadiq and White also tried to give us more exact definition, not really definition, but exact explanations about the fantasies locations which has a deepest roots in myth, legend, and fairy tale, long before the modern novel communities told tales of gods, monsters, and enchanted objects and heroic quests. Those narrative materials constitute the raw matter later fantasy authors to work. So again and again, as I have said previously, that um, something important to be noted in contemporary fantasy or in modern fantasy is that the modern fantasy also took the raw material from the myth that really constructed in any cultures, something like that one. Okay, and then next, these are the characteristics of fantasy. I think I took directly from the book. I made a screenshot from the book and then put this here. And actually, there are six general characteristics of fantasy, and you can read by yourself later on this one about six members of practice of fantasy, including the detailed setting depict another world, often located on Earth, but almost always set out of time. It means that um, when we try to look at fantasy is something different actually, because the fantasy not only set out in our recognitions of the earth, our recognized earth, something like that one. The earth, yes, of course, the place or the setting, the most important setting as in fantasy, but then one of the most important thing that the location of the earth is kindly something constructed by the imaginations. Um, then the full magic frames the story for the fantasy itself. And then number two, as Sarix and Wyatt stated, storylines feature good versus evil. I think that's the most common thing for recognizing the fantasy. And then number three, tone range from humorous to dark. There are also in modern day fantasies, like if you watch some of the modern day fantasies in Netflix, for instance, Game of Thrones, for instance, and many others. I think the most common thing also in fantasy also about how the tones ranges from humorous to dark. It means that there are so many things which actually can be considered as humorous things, but also in in some parts of the fantasy narratives, we often recognize that there are also so many dark things, like how the people also what is that taking power, how the people also taking some parts in killing, in murdering, something like that one. And also one element that also always take a part in fantasy, always about sexual act, for instance, or something like that one. Okay, and then the characters clearly defined it as good or bad. And then in general, books start slowly. Yes, the author set the scenes, designs the challenge, and introduces the cast. And it means that in fantasy writing, in fantasy narratives, um, we actually recognize some elements about how the book narrated slowly, not really in uh, what is that? Yeah, slow passing, slow plot or something like that one, slow tempos and something like that one. Okay, and then number six, from the stylized language to the use of jargon, language and style run the gamut. Language relates further pictures of characters and landscape and illustration sometimes enhance both adult and children's fantasy. It means that um, there are so there are kind of significant differences between uh, fantasy of the children fantasy and the adult fantasy or young adult fantasy because uh, one more one of the most important element to make some uh, uh, differences or to have some differences on it is actually related to the kind of like the humorous to dark, as I stated previously in the characteristic of fantasy itself. If we talk about children's fantasy, actually there are so many humorous things to be noted, to be described, to be explained in fantasy narratives. But if we talk about the young adult and adult fantasy, actually, we recognize some more uh, darkly explanations about something like about the killing, like murdering, like um, overt sexual act or something like that one. Um, that is a kind of difference between the adult and children's fantasy. And after the characteristic, we actually go to the one of the most important elements in fantasy genre. Um, when we talk about fantasy genre, actually we talk about how we build ourselves, our imagination in something beyond ourselves, in something beyond reality. So therefore, um, in the elements of fantasy, we recognize the world building as a genre engine. Why then it is being called as the engine? Because, well, um, the world building. This is like the one, like this one. When we read fantasy literature, like the historical fiction, like another things connected to historical fiction. Actually, we recognize the construction of the world directly in our imagination. Then, therefore, in imagining, in immersing our imagination, we actually construct our own world, our own constructed world, our own what is that? Reality to see that the reality we have in our imagination actually really very different from the reality we live in our daily life or something like that one. So therefore, when we talk about monsters, for instance, when we talk about the Hobbit, when we talk about something like um, what is that? The fables story about tiger which has human head, for instance, and so on and so forth. And therefore, actually, we talk about the world building. Um, and also, when we talk about the world building, we talk about something related to the craft of creating a convincing sensory and internally coherent alternate reality. So I took Sadik's and White arguments also that they stress that setting to more than decorate. It means that setting as kind of world building itself, functioning as the orders for the logic as well, and also suggesting moral landscapes and invite long-readed investment. Inviting long-readed investment means that we actually trying too hard to construct our building imagination, our constructive world, or something like that one. I gave you some examples here. Love is made, for instance. Love is made means that there are so many mates, there are so many lands which actually connected to Earth. But when we try to see that kind of map, actually we didn't find any uh, in our reality, in our real reality, something like that one. Because again and again, this actually kind of constructed maps, kind of imaginary maps, something like that one. And then also about the genealogies, about the invented languages. So therefore, when we read fantasy narratives, when we read fantasy novels, for instance, then we actually find, I mean, some interesting things in terms of the invented languages, how the names are actually strange, a weird for us, like in Game of Thrones, for instance, Daenerys Targaryen, or something like that one. It is actually strange name, like Frodo, for instance, in in Lord of the Rings, like Hermione Granger. Actually, so that's something unusual name, and then therefore we actually uphold it. This is something invented languages um, in that thing. And glossaries are not mere ornaments, but tools that help readers inhabit the world. So it means that again and again that when we immerse, when we trying to have a deep recognition to the fantasy world, then those things, the lavish maps, genealogies, invented languages, and glossaries are not mere ornaments, but tools that help readers inhabit the world. Whether it is a quasi medieval Middle Earth, the dynasty court of the Song of Ice and Fire, or urban spaces where the supernatural quietly intrudes. World building also shapes passing. As I talked to you previously, that pacing is one of the most important elements as well in inside the fantasy narratives. Passing means the tempos. Passing means the element of how the story being the story elements being connected to each other in time, something like that one. Um, which is later on also constructing the plot, or something like that. Shapes the passing slow openings to establish melee, later acceleration toward confrontation, and so on and so forth. And those are explaining why many fantasy narratives are serialized, because it has more related to sprawling politics, mythic arcs, long quests naturally demand multi-volume forms. So this is actually logical to think about this series of fantasy. Fantasy is kind of series. Lord of the Rings has three trilogy, for instance. Harry Potter has uh, six or uh, what which numbers actually Harry Potter's I forget about the series of the Harry Potters and so on and so forth. So those are actually connected to the one most important element, the world building itself. World building is kind of the engine to burn our own imagination in reading, to have the powerful imaginations about the setting, about the decorations of the world constructed in fantasy itself, something like that one. Okay, and then yeah, my camera is on again. And then next about what is that? Wait a minute. Yeah, the identity and ideology in fantasy narratives. This one is a subtitle given to me by Miss Dian Nurrachman to talk about how fantasy itself, how fantasy from the myth, from the traditional myth, from the foundational myth of the legends or folklores and so on and so forth, also contribute to construct the identity and the agility. Um, well, fantasy uh, is therefore then a kind of privileged site for a, a contested ideological rehearsal. It means that when we talk about fantasy elements, we actually not only given some stories, we are not only given some magical elements, no, but we also given as some other things, as some the let's say what is that? As some other novels, other narratives, other works of literature also deliver to us something about the questions. How then the questions about power, justice, community, and leadership also available inside the fantasy uh, in functioning to dramatize the life in dramatizing our life. So therefore, those kind of questions is really dramatized in heightened terms. So the frame elements author choose, like historical analogues, mythic paradigms, cultural tropes, bend readers toward particular readings. A medievalized frame can naturalize hierarchical rulership, retelling of legends, and recuperate or question national myths. Well, I think I'm going to share with you in terms of, let's say, what is that? Our local myth. How then, for instance, if you recognize Sangkuriang, for instance, as the myth, um, in Sudanese culture, Sangkuriang is actually really, really important to construct the Sundanese identity. Why it is so? Because by reading, by immersing our own imaginations to uh, Sangkuriang story, Sangkuriang myth, then actually Sundanese people can also recognize some values like the forbidden thing in incest, for instance, like how we should avoid a kind of disobedience. We have to obey our parents. We have to obey our own strict rules in our lives, something like that one. Then it was told in myth like Sangkuriang as well. Then it is also something related to how historical analogues trying to get more recognition in terms of in terms of the historical analogues. Then we are actually connected to the origins of the Mount Tangkuban Parahu, for instance, when we talk about when we analyze, when we read Sangkuriang myth. And it means that in terms of the origins of the Mount Tangkuban Parahu, we actually shared the common cultural tropes and mythic paradigms which also construct an identity of Sundanese people, of Sundanese culture itself. But actually, we, at least for me, we actually hardly find um, kind of national myth because Indonesia is not actually constructed from one one myth, one element, one story. There are so many stories of local culture which construct Indonesian values. But then could not we hardly find one most constructed myth to have the identity of Indonesia, I think. If if Beowulf, for instance, if you uh, ever heard about Beowulf, kind of myth legends in British culture as something, what is that? The first and the origin of British literature, the legend of the Beowulf. Then actually we recognize that Beowulf trying help help British people to construct their identity, and also Robin Hood, for instance. Robin Hood is kind of myth, kind of legend, kind of folklore as well, which also construct the British national identity, something like that one. Okay, so in short, in these explanations, fantasy encodes social and political ideas. At surface level, the genre often adheres a binary moral economy, good versus evil, hero versus tyrant. The chapter also notes important complexities, anti-heroes, morally ambiguous leaders, and plots where victory carries sacrifice and loss. So it means that um, yeah, as I told you before, previously, that Robin Hood, for instance, it is actually told about the anti-heroes. Um, Robin Hood was the myth, was the legend, which who actually uh, gave us some important elements about how being thieves actually can be considered as heroes, and therefore it is kind of morally ambiguous. One, um, how come we recognize a thief, a burglar, but then uh, for for the people in British culture, then Robin Hood is kind of hero. It means that there are some kind of ambiguous things, ambiguous morality, and also kind of ambivalences when we uh, share the same thing about ambiguous, that kind of ambiguous thing. Actually, we uh, do not have, what is that? We do not have kind of a single judgment to the shared values we have, something like that one. And therefore, all the plots also connected to how the victory carries sacrifice and loss. Yeah, of course, because when we talk about the fantasy, we actually could not leave from the important thing like war, like how the war is actually connected to victory or lost, I mean. A victory carries sacrifice. There are so many sacrifices. There are so many sacrificing things. There are so many victims. But then another one, we also uh, carried off to see that that is a victory, something like that one. And in Susan Collins, the Hunger Games, for instance, we actually talk about this one, the morally ambiguous leaders, plots where victory carries sacrifice and loss, the revolt or the rebellion connected to um, the figure in the Hunger Games actually, uh, yeah, carrying our imagination in terms of the victory, which actually also a kind of victimized victory, a victimized um, what is that? Independence, something like that one. Okay, that's a kind of identity and ideology in fantasy. We could also say that fantasy brings to us deliberately uh, to convey social critique. Um, then therefore, it is fantasy also can be considered as something ideological in that what's that in the sign. Okay, next we still have about um, another elements. Um, this is a tonal and formal variety. Character as idea. If the world building is the setting, then actually we could also bring some more important elements about the tonal and formal variety. This is actually still connected to the ideology, how the ideology itself was really constructed by our enjoyment of reading to the character, to the character who brings us the ideology itself. So therefore, um, there are the variety of the tonal range of fantasy, from the dark, elegiac atmospheres of green epics to the playful satire of comic fantasy, and it highlights how characters often personify ethical stances or philosophical ideas. And well, I think I I I I have to be hurry up in terms of the explanations. Okay, I think I'm going to read just read it first. Heroes embody courage, sacrifice, and resilience. Villains dramatize greed, corruption, or nihilism. Those are uh, the contradictory things that also uh, developed by the character in fantasy, like any other works of literature as well, actually. Even where characterization is complex, between villains and heroes, readers prize clarity and the premise that moral striving yields some form of justice, even if daily bounds. The pleasure in fantasy is both imaginative and moral, something like that one. Okay, this is a kind of tonal and formal variety, which is included inside the character. The tonal and formal variety means how we can what is that? How can we recognize that the characters have uh, many directions, many ideologies, many identities? Then therefore, it is related to the tonal, to the tone, how the characters speak about himself, how the characters speak about themselves, how the characters also see the reality of the world through their lens of language and so on and so forth. That's the tonal and formal meaning. And next, we will share about yeah, this is the cultural impact of franchises, adaptations, multimedia, film series, games. This is, I think, one of the most important thing in talking about how the fantasy, how the modern fantasy is being created. Sorry. Square adaptations, films, television series, and other media have transformed fantasy from a niche literary field into a central popular culture force. Means that through movies, through games, through series, and then the revolution of our own technology in internet, in some kind of other things of the information technology also can be made as a powerful media to have or to what is that to socialize, to have a socialization about the myth, the fantasy, the legend, the folks, and so on and so forth. That it is actually connected to the cultural impact. In now in modern days, we see or we recognize the fantasy element through our visual much more than reading. Then therefore, our visualization of the fantasy elements actually can also be different from one another. Um, I give you an example here. Peter Jackson, The Lord of the Rings films, and HBO's Game of Thrones are singled out as watershed moments that broaden audiences, drove massive reprints and tie-in editions, and created expectations for spectacle and sheer reality that shape publishing and marketing strategies. And therefore, you actually, as a student of this study program of English for Industry, I think you have to be more creative to start how then you may come to have the fantasy, but then that kind of fantasy is not really static because you can also create some kind of fantasy elements inside your own imaginations to be creatively created as in media in any platform. Something like that one. You have to think about that one thing because you know you are the student for the English for industry, especially in that yeah in this is um to have fantasy is increasingly into it. However, science and the genre is